And now to the topic at hand. So having raced in the last 5 weeks through the biblical book of Leviticus, in this last session, as I said, I thought we could look at some of the ways that the story has been taken up and used. Some of its reception, but more than reception, its appropriation and sort of deployment for various means. It's worth saying from the beginning that at this point, we're not really talking about the book of Exodus itself, right? It's the Exodus story, the bounds of which extend backward and forward from Exodus. Right? You may remember I said in the first class that the book of Exodus doesn't really exist. So too, for those who take up and use the Exodus story, the canonical boundaries aren't so important, right? It's the story, all the way back to the descent of Joseph and his family to Egypt, into enslavement and departure from the Red Sea to Sinai and into the wilderness, and all the way to the conquest of the land, which is obviously well outside of the bounds of the canonical book. So it's the story that people really take up more than it is the actual book. And we're going to look at the way that the story has been used from a number of different angles, none of which is going to be even remotely comprehensive. There's not time for that, I'm afraid. But I want to give a sense, even in brief, of just how prominent the story has been, if you didn't know it already, and in its various appropriations that we're going to be talking about today, just how flexible it turns out to be. This is a story that has served people in different places and times and in different ways, all of which I think in the end speaks to just how powerful and central Exodus has been. So the Exodus event, the story of the leaving of Egypt, was already in the Hebrew Bible the defining historical marker for Israelite identity, right? It was this experience and equally its sort of analogous event of the exile. It was this experience that set Israel apart from everyone else on earth. You may remember when we talked about the Ten Commandments, for example, that begin, "I am Yahweh your God who took you out of the land of Egypt." That's the definition of the relationship and the definition of who Israel is. This being the identity marker for Israel, both good and bad. In the Hellenistic period, so even already still in the biblical period writ large, in the Hellenistic period, that is the centuries from the 4th century onward, BCE. In that period, Israel, now moving closer to being identified as Judaism, suddenly, really for the first time, confronts the problem of assimilation with this dominant Greek culture that threatens to essentially overwhelm it. I should say, refer to we refer to the Greeks as pagans, right? Like there was the normal believing peoples, our peoples, and then there's all those pagans. Right? So pagans comes to have this pejorative sense, but for the Greeks, the Hellenistic, for the Greeks and Romans, it was the Jews who were the weirdos, right, with their strange rituals and practices. They were the Jews were the odd ones out. The Greeks were doing everything totally normally. And Hellenistic authors, looking at these Jews with their strange customs and traditions, took great delight in mocking them for it. And some of the ways they did that are particularly interesting. They retold the Exodus story. Moses, though not a prophet sent by God, but described as like a charlatan who essentially tricked Israel into following him. The Israelites, it turned out, didn't escape from Egypt in this glorious salvation. No. They were a leper colony that was kicked out by the Egyptians who didn't want them there. So these are just a couple of the ways that the Greco-Roman authors sort of took up the Exodus story. But it's interesting that this is the story that they chose to mock the Jews. It's like they knew that Jewish identity was wrapped up in this story. So this was like the perfect way to sort of stick it to them. But of course, when culture is attacked this way, there needs to be a response of some sort. And indeed, two very prominent Jewish authors of this period responded to the Hellenistic attacks on Judaism. These would be Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century BCE, and a century later Josephus, writing in Palestine and Rome, a century later. And what they did is they tried to explain Moses and the Exodus to their Hellenistic peers. And what's interesting about the way that they did this is they didn't defend Israel's distinctiveness. But instead what they did was they took the Exodus story and they effectively Hellenized it to make it comprehensible to a Greco-Roman audience. So Josephus presents Moses as a paragon of Hellenistic virtues. He's a great general. He's a brilliant orator. He's an exemplar of stoicism. He's also a philosopher and a lawgiver, right? Like Plato and Pericles, right? Josephus makes all these direct comparisons. He literally, let me see, Philo now turning to, literally describes Moses as passing his idle time studying philosophy, while wandering 40 years in the desert. What did he do? Well, he whiled away his time reading his philosophy and studying, as you can see in this quote here. Philo makes Moses like this ideal Platonic philosopher king. Philo also, interestingly, makes Israel into something more even than a group of escaped slaves, as the Bible has it. He describes the Exodus actually as a colonization of Canaan, which is, of course, a concept that in the Greco-Roman imperial context would have made all the sense in the world. An interesting element of how Josephus and Philo tell the Exodus stories is both of them actually leave the Sinai covenant out entirely. And again, this is like a nod toward assimilation, right? Jews, yes, we may have different practices, but it's not like we have some separate deal with God. Right? We do things a little differently, and they explain that in other places. But our story is like a good, normal Greco-Roman story. You guys should understand who we are, right? We're just like you. In retrospect, it's kind of a weird move to use the Exodus story of all things to argue that Jews aren't actually distinctive, but instead share in the cultural values of their Hellenistic context, because of course the Exodus story in the Bible was the very thing that made Israel distinctive. But again, here you can see that this is the story around which identity was built, whether it was distinctive identity or assimilating identity. Moving on a little bit in time, I am in no way a New Testament person, but we can briefly look at the Exodus in the New Testament a bit. And we have to remember before we start that much of the New Testament is addressed to Jews. And continuity, therefore, with Jewish tradition is key. The whole point was that Jesus was the next step in the same continuous story. So the covenantal blood of the Last Supper harkens back to the blood of the covenant at Sinai, for an easy example. But of course, there's more. The entire book of Matthew is structured along the Exodus story, and it's structured in order to make Jesus the new Moses, as it were. So you can see some of those parallels here. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. This is a chart that was taken from a book by Dale Allison about this, about Matthew and the Exodus. We can see how this works as a sort of explicit parallel in the opening episode of Matthew's account, and here it is, at least in probably too much text to read at once, but if we look at it, we've got, this is the story of Jesus and family fleeing to Egypt, and it is, I mean, astonishingly similar and clearly evoking the story of Moses fleeing Egypt, especially the remaining there until the death of Herod. Upon the death of Herod, go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead, is almost verbatim from, go return to Egypt, for those who are seeking your life are dead, as God says to Moses. This move of this fleeing to Egypt, it gets, for Matthew, it gets Jesus into Egypt, which puts him in the context of the Exodus tradition, and it does the job of identifying Herod with Pharaoh and Rome with Egypt, all of which reorients the reader for the new revelation of Jesus. The Exodus story here is the link for the transition from one identity to another. Now, of course, there are so many references to Moses in the Exodus story in the New Testament, I can't do them all, of course, but we might note things like Paul equating Jesus with the Passover sacrifice, for one famous example. And in that same context, it's not just a one-off. Paul is doing a whole bit here about leaven and the Passover sacrifice. So he's using the whole story complex. Further on in Corinthians, we get the crossing of the sea. We get reference to the water from the rock. What Paul is doing here is bringing in Israel's past to explain its present and future. The coming of Jesus marked sort of the real-time salvation of Israel. And the Exodus story is the old-time salvation of Israel that is the sort of the parallel and echo. Okay, I want to move on to a different use of the Exodus story. So we looked a little bit about how some early, what we call Second Temple Jewish authors and the New Testament bring in the Exodus story. And now I want to move on to something different, which is its ritualization, specifically in Judaism. This is a leaf from a text known as the Barcelona Haggadah, which the Haggadah, as I will be saying in a moment, is sort of like the script for the Passover Seder in Judaism. So already in the Bible, the Passover sacrifice was like the pinnacle ritual event for Israel. But we should be clear to distinguish, right? It was the sacrifice that was the important moment, not what we think of now, which is the 7 days of eating unleavened bread, or 7 days of not eating leavened bread. The sacrifice was the crucial identifying marker and pinnacle ritual event for Israel, because it was public and communal, as sacrifices were. What you eat in your own home for the next 7 days, I mean, it's a private matter. You're supposed to do it, but it doesn't. It's not a communal event. So the Passover sacrifice was the big deal. But when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, of course, sacrifice ended forever so far, and this left an obvious gap for Judaism. How should we celebrate this central ritual? Of course, this was how we got most of modern Judaism at all, and this was the driving question post-sacrifice. Right? When sacrifice has ended, how do we make ourselves? How do we rebuild? How do we reconstruct our identity? But we're here to talk about how this worked with the Passover sacrifice. And the first step was, okay, it was a festival sacrifice, which means it was the kind of sacrifice where you make an offering and you get some food back and you have a party and you eat it. So, okay, we're going to turn this festival sacrifice into a ritual meal. Again, not a big step because they were already eating some of the Passover sacrifice. But okay, what should we eat on this in this ritual meal? Well, the Bible talks about bitter herbs and unleavened bread, so for sure we'll do some of that. When should we eat it? They thought. Well, okay, we'll eat it at the exact same time that the sacrifices were offered according to the Bible. So the Bible says you have to offer the sacrifices at twilight, so that's when we're going to do this ritual meal at home. Okay, they said, what should we sing? during the meal? Well, let's sing the same psalms that had been sung at the temple during the Passover sacrifice. So this home ritual, the Seder, replaces the temple-based sacrificial ritual. And actually, you can see this quite clearly in the way that the Seder, the Haggadah, transforms the biblical text. The Bible has famously the questions. When your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You say, this is the Passover sacrifice because he passed over the houses, etc. That gets transformed in the Haggadah, in the Passover Seder, not into a question about the sacrificial rites, but about the ritual meal we're having here itself. And so at the center of the Seder is the telling of the story and the explanation of the elements of the ritual. And this is really an interesting moment. Most rituals don't explain themselves. Even if we might have explanations for them, rituals are often identifiable as rituals precisely because they don't come with rationales. When we think about all of the sort of ritual motions and movements and orders and things that we do in a religious service of really any kind, a lot of them we do because that's how we do them. But here in the Passover Seder, the link between the ritual and the Exodus is made explicit and over again throughout the Seder. It's constant self-explanation. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because we do this to symbolize this. This is, in effect, the updated version of the central religious rite of ancient Israel. And it centers on the fundamental story of Israel and Judaism. And it's the doing of the ritual and the remembering of the past, or at least the creation of a communal memory of past events. Right? It's all of that that binds the community together, right? Which is what rituals do. But this ritual, again, is like really markedly centered around the story, and does so in a way that reflects the new status of Judaism post-temple, and not just post-temple, but post-diaspora, right? The dispersion of Israel and Judaism all around the world. Without a central temple and with Jews living all over the place, what brings the community together? What brings them together is that they can now participate in this Passover ritual, right? What was the central ritual of the temple is now a ritual that's performed in every Jewish home, regardless of where they are. So anywhere around the world, in their own homes, they recreate community and identity around story, and having sort of broken the temple space up and scattered it everywhere. I could say something also about the way that this gets taken up in Eucharist and in Easter, but I'll just invite you to go check out my book that talks about all of that instead. I don't have time. And so what I'm going to do is, having played a little bit in some of the ways that this was taken up in the ancient world, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. We're going to skip, I don't know, 1,500 years. Not because nothing interesting happened in there, but because, again, we only have so much time. And we're going to stay with the theme of identity formation, which again, I think is essentially the most basic element of the Exodus story, at least how it's ever been used. But we're going to look at groups that aren't actually Israel. At least, I mean, they may identify as such in certain ways, but they're clearly not. And what we're going to see is how these groups identify with the Israel of the Exodus story as they form their own identities and communities. Right? These are all going to be groups that I'm about to talk about that are starting something new, whether they're making a physical journey or just making a conceptual break of some kind with their past or their origins. For groups like this, the Exodus story, it turns out, was an obvious symbol, even when the parallels, like in reality, weren't particularly strong or obvious. Right? we're not talking here, for the most part, about groups literally escaping, like physically, geographically escaping from slavery, but communities defining themselves as something new and as something grounded in shared experience. And that's fundamentally what the Exodus story is. It's more than just slavery and freedom. So I'm going to just like poke around a little bit and start with Luther and the Reformation. Now, for Luther, the Exodus story loomed large. He may not have called himself Moses, though I have the sense he probably would have given the opportunity. But he was certainly happy to refer to the Pope and to papists as Pharaoh in Egypt, as you can see from this this quote here, where he's talking about Catholics, you know, what he would call papists. You know, again, saying, you know, it's possible to make a mistake through ignorance, but I've taught them, right? I've said the things and they are hardened, right? If he be hardened and not yield to the truth, like Pharaoh, who would not acknowledge his sins or humble himself before God. So he's anticipating the destruction of the papacy and the Catholic Church, and very clearly identifying this with identifying them with Pharaoh in Egypt, which again, he may not be saying it out loud, but that does leave him effectively as Moses here. Now, of course, given that Luther was also, you know, a rabid anti-Semite, his feelings about Moses were, shall we say, somewhat mixed. And here's a quote where he compares Moses to the Pope, which again is a totally unsurprising development. The equation of Judaism and Catholicism is a really long-standing one that lasted within the Reformation and lasted certainly all the way down into 19th, I would say even 20th century biblical scholarship as a sort of standard ploy. So that's Luther. Calvin, for his part, also used Moses in his calls for reform. Calvin was a big Moses fan. Moses' style of leadership, Calvin took as a model. So here's Calvin talking about sort of separations of power. He's saying, right, Moses could speak only what God told him. And so too, ecclesiastical power, that is the power of the church and the Pope, should not go beyond its bounds of what it's granted from God, but should be confined within certain limits. And here's Moses, who never said anything to anyone that God didn't tell him to. That's how the Pope ought to be. So Moses was a model of the sort of ecclesial leadership, but more than that for Calvin. For Calvin personally, Moses was a leader, a model, for a number of reasons. In part because of his failure to actually accomplish the thing. But my favorite part of this is Calvin insisted that when he died, he be buried in an unmarked tomb, just as Moses had been buried in an unmarked and unknown grave. I'll add that Calvin has this wonderful, really marvelous commentaries on biblical books, including Exodus, where he's going through and often is just explaining what he thinks the text means and what the moral lessons we should get from it are. And sometimes he just breaks out and sort of says, like, okay, this is just like Catholics. This is just like the church. So when he's going through the Exodus story, he gets the part where Pharaoh says to Moses, you know, why should I listen to you? Who is Yahweh? Right? I don't know this God. And Calvin says, we may remark a like madness in all idolaters. The cry of the papists nowadays is that we're imposing a new God on the world. So, you know, direct one-to-one correspondence, right? Just like it was then, Pharaoh, just like papists today. And similarly, when Pharaoh calls for his magicians to contest with Aaron and Moses, Calvin says, and how many nowadays among the papists are followers of wicked superstitions under the pretext of simplicity? It's like he just can't help himself. What we see in both Luther and Calvin, and we'll continue to see, is the identification of themselves and their group as the oppressed Israel, and their opponents, the dominant religious forces in their society, as the new Pharaoh. And that's, again, following who identifies as Israel and who they identify as Pharaoh is kind of the fun game here. This idea found remarkably thorough expression in the founding of the Dutch Republic. In the 16th century, history lesson, in the 16th century, what is now the Netherlands was controlled by the Catholic Habsburg Empire, and Dutch reformers rose up, led by William of Orange, who had been exiled but returned to lead this rebellion. And if the Exodus weren't already sort of totally overwhelmed the Reformation mindset conceptually, the particular historical circumstances in the Netherlands really exacerbated the parallels. We had about 150,000 Protestants living in the Catholic South who moved up to the north, not only replicating sort of the mass movement of people from the Exodus story, but doing so in the Netherlands, right? So across a ton of waterways. And so the crossing of the Red Sea became a sort of fixture of Dutch art. And here we finally have a Moses figure worthy of the name in William of Orange, who amazingly was in fact a member of the Habsburg nobility, who decided that in fact he was going to leave the nobility and go fight for the common people who felt oppressed religiously. He was exiled. He returned to lead his people. He died before the war was over, so he never made it to the promised land. And as a result, unsurprisingly, he was regularly depicted as Moses in art and drama in the Netherlands. And Rembrandt's famous portrait of Moses that I've got for you here, which is, by the way, a gigantic painting. This is a mark of this Dutch identification with the Exodus story, right? This isn't it's just a happenstance that this is what he happened to is that what Rembrandt painted here. Quick side note about the Dutch experience: even while the Dutch reformers claimed the mantle of Israel in Exodus, so too did their Catholic opponents, because remember, if we've got the reformers moving from the south to the north, their arrival meant the oppression in the north of the Catholics who were living there, who then themselves moved south. Their Catholic religious beliefs and practices having been banned in the north. They also had a claim to be Israel. And so we have both sides using the Exodus imagery at each other, or at least about each other, which is a kind of lovely example of just how flexible the Exodus tradition is and how claimable, right? Both sides looked at what was happening and they were like, yeah, I know what story this is, and I'm Israel, which is a sort of remarkable, lovely thing. Meanwhile, while this is happening in the Netherlands, over in England, the Reformation's taking place as well, of course, with our good friend Henry VIII. For English reformers, whatever Henry's motives may have been, this was a breakthrough moment, naturally. And was Henry to be considered a new Moses? Well, his wife, Catherine Parr, certainly thought he was. I love this quote because it's so over the top. "Our Moses and most godly, wise governor and king hath delivered us out of the captivity and bondage of Pharaoh. I mean by Moses, King Henry VIII, and I mean by this Pharaoh, the Bishop of Rome." Right? And then, in turns, and actually, we had it even worse, which is a funny thing to say when she was already the queen. It's hard to claim it was too tough. So there's Catherine. This is the frontispiece of the Great Bible of 1519. There is Henry sitting there in sort of Moses imagery. I'm not going to go into all the details, but this is Henry as Moses. Similarly, some 20 years later, the King James comes out. Here's the frontispiece of that, and with obviously Moses right there, front and center. So Exodus imagery all over the place in the English Reformation. After Henry, it takes an interesting turn, actually. We get to Elizabeth, who was certainly not Catholic, but was also not really a very pure reformer. She was more interested in keeping the peace. But the purists, right, the reformers who were like really wanted to bring England fully into the Reformation. So these purists, who we know as Puritans, were very disappointed with Elizabeth's reign. As they talked about this, they talked about Elizabeth leaving them stranded in the wilderness, right? She was like Moses, but she couldn't finish the job. So again, using the same Exodus imagery. When Charles I took power in 1625, I hardly need to tell you all the English history. In any case, when Charles I took power, Charles was actively anti-Puritan. The Exodus story was again the mechanism for understanding current events. Oliver Cromwell becomes the new Moses, I guess another new Moses. There's a lovely quote from Richard Cromwell, his son, who just uses the biblical text and then tells us he's using the biblical text to compare his father to Moses. My father died full of days. His eyes were not waxed dim, neither was his natural strength abated, which is a quote directly from Deuteronomy 34, the death of Moses. So there's Cromwell as a Moses figure. You got the Quakers, who were anti-Cromwell, who were like, no, Protestantism is enslavement. Essentially, everybody, as far as I can tell, in England in this period was invoking the Exodus. It's almost like it was the only language they had available for analogy to their various situations. The Puritans, who left England for America, took their story and their Exodus identity with them. And no surprise, it must have been absolutely irresistible to them as they are, leaving England and crossing the great body of water to found a new civilization in what they hoped would be their promised land. This is a quote from William Bradford, who would go on to be governor of Plymouth Colony, right? Likening himself and his peers to Moses and the Israelites. In turn, Bradford was described as a Moses figure by some. This is a moment when, as I sort of tell this ongoing story, it's a moment when we might pause for a second just to consider the extent of the Exodus story, right? Its scope and bounds. In broad terms, the Exodus story isn't just leaving one place, even though that's often sort of how we tell the story, right? We tell the story about it, and then they left Egypt, and maybe they crossed the Red Sea, and hurrah, that's the end. But that's not the end, of course. They're leaving one place to go to another. There's a promised land on the other side of the Exodus. And in the Bible, that promised land is occupied, right? There are people living there. And so too, the promised land of the pilgrims. The ethical complications, shall we say, are or should be relatively apparent. Redemption and divine blessing are all well and good for Israel, however we define Israel. They are not so good for the Canaanites or for the latter-day equivalents of the Canaanites. Now, to the Pilgrims' credit, they seemed to recognize these ethical issues. The leading minister of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Cotton, said very clearly, no nation is to drive out another without special commission from heaven. He wasn't saying we have that commission. He was saying we should not be we shouldn't be killing off all the Native Americans because we don't have this. But at the same time, no one seemed to mind, say, the smallpox that devastated the Native Americans, including, notably, King James himself. In the charter for the New England colony, says, we have been further given certainly to know that within these late years there hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague. So he's reading the smallpox as the work of God clearing out the native population for the arrival of the pilgrims, or Israel, as it were. Okay, I'm going to keep going a tiny bit. I need to. I don't need it all to describe in detail the ways the Exodus story was used rhetorically during the American Revolution. England was obviously Egypt with its oppressive taxes that, as Jefferson put it, were a deliberate systematical plan of reducing us to slavery, obviously invoking Exodus imagery. The king was obviously Pharaoh, and there was you can imagine little doubt as to who the new Moses would be in the American Revolution. As Cyprian Strong, this is just a preacher from the time, said, God qualified and raised up Moses. In like manner, God raised up a Washington. Here's a quote from Timothy Dwight, a preacher, president of Yale. A strong resemblance between Moses and the hero of our own country is so evident that the recital of it is become almost proverbial. And indeed, I put this one up here because I have a collection of, I mean, I didn't even do a full sweep, God knows, but I've got a collection of a dozen of these that I could have put up here. But indeed, especially upon his death, everybody described Washington as Moses. I'm going to take one more step in this story, because less than 100 years later, America generated its own internal exodus. In this case, the exodus of the Mormons, who could not have been more straightforward about claiming the Exodus story as their own. They had the persecution and the oppression. That part was easy, plenty of that. They had a long journey across a wilderness. They had the promised land of what would turn out to be Salt Lake City. They were super open about this. When Brigham Young was moving the people across the country, they called themselves the Camp of Israel. They literally arranged themselves into divisions along biblical lines, like we have the Camp of Israel set up in the Bible. Young himself even actually thought the Mormons had done it better than Israel had. And Young himself was the new Moses. Young was like, yeah, Israel. What's his line was something like, I don't have a slide of it, but I think Brigham Young said something like, they just went like a few miles down the road, right? Recognizing the distance between Israel and Egypt not being very much. He's like, we had to go, 2,500 miles across this country. And he said things like, I feel all the time like Moses. So, very, very clear story there. I could have told like any number of similar stories about groups taking up the Exodus story. What I like about the sort of series that I just went through here is that they're all actually connected, right? One group identifies as Israel, but once they go through the experience and achieve freedom and achieve power, they then become Egypt. It's like sort of Russian nesting dolls of identification. Going through an Exodus experience, it turns out, doesn't make you more tolerant. The oppressed seem to always become the oppressor once they become the dominant power, and the cycle just begins again. So you just see, a group that recognizes itself as Exodus in the story and recognizes that they're escaping from an Egypt, and then they get to their promised land, and with a generation later, someone's accusing them of being Egypt and identifying themselves as Israel. It's sort of a marvelous example of, again, the way that this story keeps getting taken up in a cyclical fashion throughout history. And how it, again, is like the dominant story for this kind of internal escape and rebellion and move toward a kind of freedom. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to look at one more area in which Exodus story was taken up. And it's one that brings the story down, roughly speaking, into our own time and place, for those of us who are in America, at least. But it is a story that begins back in the American Revolution, when the self-styled Israel of America overthrows its British master and then subsequently fails, as we all know, to apply the same principles of freedom internally, right? Because American slavery continued after the American Revolution and, in fact, expanded wildly. So in this context, we should remember that our common reading of the Exodus story as being about freedom from slavery is, in the Bible at least, no such thing. And I have sort of said this before. I've noted in an earlier session that Israelites owned slaves. And here is my sort of go-to text on this from Leviticus. Israelites owned slaves and, in fact, were permitted to treat their foreign slaves as poorly as they themselves had been treated in Egypt. So in principle, thinking back to America, the idea of an Exodus-oriented people themselves owning slaves isn't really unbiblical. But even at this point in history, the Exodus story was clearly understood as being a story about the sort of universal value of freedom and against slavery. And so many people, especially preachers, held up the Bible to oppose slavery. This is a quote from Granville Sharp, who was one of the great British abolitionists, who, again, clearly recognizing the Exodus story and its relevance to slavery, talking about the plagues and saying there's so many examples of God's vengeance against slaveholders, which ought to be had in everlasting remembrance, to warn everyone against slaveholding. Not surprisingly, many people in the African-American community also turned to the Bible for these kinds of messages. And not surprisingly, they identified America as the New Egypt. This is from Caesar Sartor, who is a freed slave in the North. Be pleased to recollect the miserable end of Pharaoh in consequence of his refusal to set those at liberty, whom he had unjustly reduced to cruel servitude. This is all anti-slavery talk, absolutely couched in pure Exodus terms. For many in the African-American community, their experience, even as they were sort of calling for a new Exodus, their experience was one of a reversal of the traditional Exodus account. They had, in fact, been taken out of their homeland, their promised land, and they were transported into the New Egypt. So they were conscious of this story from an entirely other direction. Now, with the Bible as the conceptual basis for the movement, for the abolitionist movement, an important issue arose, which is for slaves to be oppressed and deserving of being freed, they have to be equated with Israel, right? Israel is who gets saved by God. So were the slaves, in fact, identifiable with Israel? This eventually boiled down to, do we convert slaves to Christianity or not? Christianity being understood, of course, as the new Israel. Slave owners were, in fact, often loath to convert their slaves because it would confuse the social order. Baptists and Methodists, however, strongly abolitionist communities, Baptists and Methodists in particular, pushed for conversion and emancipation and began ordaining Black preachers, which is the beginnings of the Black church in America. The Exodus story also constituted the framework for the unfortunate idea of colonizing Liberia with America's free Black population, an idea that had a remarkably strong movement in this period. This was a movement that used the Exodus story, but in a problematic way. They recognized America as a new Egypt, and we're sort of trying to, again, reverse that backward kind of Exodus thing, right? America is the new Egypt. We want to send the Black population to the promised land of Liberia. But as a movement, right, what it ends up doing is saying, yes, America is the new Egypt, but rather than change America, we're just going to reinforce basically the notion that the Black population didn't actually belong in America. And the Black population, for the most part, recognized that that was not what they wanted, and not how they wanted their story to be told. Okay, the Civil War. There's so much to say in so little time. The main feature of the Civil War with regard to the Exodus story is that both sides claimed it. Everybody understood this to be the battle at the Red Sea. This was the culminating moment of the story. Lincoln saw this, right? Pharaoh's country was cursed with plagues and his hosts were drowned in the Red Sea for striving to retain a captive people who had already served them more than 400 years. Lincoln, of course, was the new Moses for the abolitionists, right? Here's one preacher saying, he liberated more enslaved people than ever Moses set free, and those not of his kindred or his race. Again, if there's endless mentions of Washington as Moses. There's even more for Lincoln. Though Lincoln himself has one of my favorites. He was writing a letter to the governor of Illinois, who was a very strong abolitionist, just before the Emancipation Proclamation. And what he said in there was, "Hold still and see the salvation of the Lord," which is a quote directly from what Moses says to Israel on the right before the death of the Egyptians at the Red Sea. And I think it's a wonderful, it's not only a wonderful reference, but again, a wonderful example of just how this story permeated this time. For as much as Lincoln was Moses to the abolitionists, for the slave-owning South, Lincoln wasn't Moses; he was Pharaoh. Here's a Southern preacher talking about how all that the South wants is to leave and go forth in peace from their house of political bondage, but the heart of their modern Pharaoh, Lincoln, is hardened and won't let them go. And I should say, if the Bible was the battleground, slave owners had a much easier fight of things, right? They have the text on their side, really. The Bible, as I've said, is not at all anti-slavery. And so if it were just a question of pure Bible verse throwing, the South would have absolutely had this thing in hand. In fact, I think it's fair to say that if the South had won the Civil War, the Exodus story would have been held up as the divine justification for their success. Regardless, the fact that both sides could use the Exodus story so easily is further demonstration of the point that I've been trying to make throughout, which is that the Exodus story had so deeply penetrated the American imagination and sense of national self that everyone found themselves represented by it. And here Lincoln's classic observation from his second inaugural address is, as always, appropriate. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. Now, given our time constraints, and we are really up against it now, I am not going to go deeply into the use of Exodus in the American Civil Rights Movement. The centrality of the story for example, Martin Luther King is well known. All the regular references to the crossing the sea, to being in the wilderness. I am going to, with regard to the Civil Rights Movement, I'm just going to let Obama's words say it for me. This is from a speech he gave in Jerusalem before he was even president, I believe. To African Americans, the story of the Exodus was perhaps the central story, the most powerful image about emerging from the grip of human bondage to reach for liberty and human dignity, a tale that was carried from slavery through the Civil Rights Movement into today. For generations, this promise helped people weather poverty and persecution while holding on to the hope that a better day was on the horizon. That's good speech writing right there. I should say, I didn't do the Civil Rights Movement here, but for all of the stuff I'm talking about today, and for plenty more, this is all essentially material that is taken from my book on this, called The Book of Exodus, a biography, which again has all of this and much more. Entire entire topics I didn't come anywhere close to talking about here. There's just so much of it. So I'm going to close by saying this. And again, in conversation with this last bit about from Obama and the Civil Rights Movement, I will say the first Black spiritual I ever knew was Go Down Moses, because it was, amazingly, it was included in the Haggadah my family used at our Passover Seder. It was in the back along with like America the Beautiful and a bunch of other weird freedom-based texts. As a kid, right, the connection between America's history and the biblical narrative was super obvious to me. Even if I didn't know that Go Down Moses was a spiritual until later in life. I knew it as the Passover song first. But the connection was incredibly obvious. What was less obvious, I think, to me was that the Seder, this thing that we did every year, captured another aspect of the civil rights movement, which is its ongoing nature and lack of finality. At the end of the Seder, even though there's a state of Israel, we still every year say next year in Jerusalem. There's a placing of ourselves in the story back into the Exodus that goes beyond sort of the circumstances we find ourselves in reality. And that's where I want to leave us today, and I guess for the class as a whole. When we take up the Exodus story, which we do constantly, whether communally or individually or smaller or larger groups, when we take up the Exodus story and identify as Israel, we should always be asking ourselves, where in the story are we? Are we in the story, are we oppressed in Egypt in the story? Looking and hoping for salvation? Are we standing triumphant on the shores of the Red Sea, our enemy having been vanquished? Are we remembering that triumph precedes a long wandering in the wilderness? What looked like victory may not have been. Are we in fact in the wilderness somewhere? Are we at the beginning of the wilderness? Are we close to the end of the wilderness? And after the wilderness, then what? A new beginning, perhaps, but with that new beginning and with our own freedom from whatever it was we're emerging from, also perhaps new oppression for others. If we identify as Israel, we should think, who is Egypt, but also who are the Canaanites in our story? All of which to say the ethics of the Exodus story are complicated, as I hope to have shown over the last few weeks, as is the book of Exodus itself. I have very much enjoyed spending this time with you. I hope you've enjoyed it as well.